Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. When World War I broke out in 1914, women in 8 states, mostly in the West, had the right to vote. Women in the other 40 states that made up the United States at the time did not have the right to vote. America's involvement in the war spurred on many suffragists, who, while not all united in their response to the war, viewed with hope President Woodrow Wilson's framing of America's involvement in World War I as a defense of democracy. Hope that it would encourage accountability at home, for how could you make the world safe for democracy with half the nation disenfranchised? As with the Preparedness movement and the war, Wilson's public position on women's suffrage evolved during his 2 terms. Andrew Phillips, curator of the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Staunton, Virginia, joins us today to discuss this evolution and Wilson's role in women's suffrage. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me.
So from 1855 to 1888, Wilson taught at Bryn Mawr, a women's college. By all accounts, he was not particularly impressed with his students. So could you describe his early thoughts on suffrage?
That's a polite way to say how he described his own students. He was not always complimentary, for sure. There are times when, in various letters, he describes them as things like intelligent and willing to learn. But at other times, he complains that it doesn't make sense for him to be teaching political science to students who won't be able to vote themselves. He doesn't, at this time at least, make the leap then, well, maybe they should be able to vote. But that will eventually, thankfully, come. And when he leaves Bryn Mawr to teach at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, he's positively giddy about the prospect of teaching a class of men, that this will be something that will actually be a challenge for him. But his early views on suffrage are even less conflicted. He writes in an 1896 letter, "I'm opposed to women's suffrage." Couldn't be more plain than that. His views on that issue evolve significantly over his life, but he begins, his baseline is no, early in his life, at a time, at least before he has any sort of political power.
Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I always have this impression of Wilson as being a man confident in his ability to charm ladies. He's not some dandy, wasting all of his time on that. He's a very serious, hardworking man. But he likes women, and I think he generally seems to find their company very enjoyable and relaxing. As president, is he able to charm the suffragists that he meets? And what is his relationship like with them at the start of his presidency?
I can give 2 answers here. I can give the little bit more boring one and say that Wilson's life is defined by strong women, and he consciously or subconsciously really does surround himself with them. They're all very different, for sure. It's not just one type of person, but his mother, both of his wives, all 3 of his daughters, and honestly, including the woman that he meets in Bermuda and that he has what seems to have been an only emotional affair, but still had quite a relationship with. They are all very strong women in different ways, strong people in different ways. And they shape his life in many different ways as well. I'd argue more than his male friendships, more than his male relationships, except for perhaps maybe his dad. But the other version of that answer is that Wilson had a more amorous nature, perhaps, than we might expect, given his serious, stoic sort of depiction. The letters he writes, primarily to Ellen and Edith, the women that he marries, or at the time he's writing is married to, though again with that woman in Bermuda, Mary Ellen Holbert Peck, not exclusively just to Ellen and Edith. But those love letters are not perhaps as descriptive as the Waring Harding letters that were published not too long ago, just a few years ago, I believe. But there's a reason that in some of those letters, Wilson signs them as Tiger, and it's not just because he went to Princeton. But I mean, all of that really is to say that Wilson seemed to think that he was doing fairly well in his early personal life, in his early political life, when he was asked, often by female activists or female journalists, what is his position on suffrage? And he thinks that he's doing a good job, that perhaps he thinks he is being very charming or coy or successfully deflecting when he says stuff like, oh, it's a very complicated issue. It's still something I'm thinking about. Or when a little bit later, he starts insisting that I am in support of a woman's right to vote, but it needs to happen on a state-by-state basis. It needs to happen that way. You need to focus locally, not make it a national issue. He is not doing as well as he thinks he is. And many are understandably frustrated by this hedging and the lack of support from the President of the United States, whoever they may be, is one of the reasons that some suffragists feel the need to move beyond the slow work of meetings and advocacy and into direct protest.
Do we know how Wilson's first and second wife and then his daughters felt about the suffrage movement? And did this influence him in any way?
Absolutely. It influenced him. And we know quite a bit about what each of them thought, and all five of them, the three daughters and the two wives. And the most unambiguously in favor are the daughters, not too surprisingly. They're young women who have been raised to be strong and independent people. They've all gone to higher education in some capacity and with varying degrees of success, but all of them are very much in and of the world. And it's Jessie, the middle daughter, who worked at a settlement house in Philadelphia and could be called, I think, legitimately a full suffragist, but not just a supporter. But her sisters are very much supporters as well. And from an interview that Ellen, the first wife, gives in 1913, it is clear that at least Jessie is constantly pushing her parents to be in favor of this issue that is so important to her and to so many others. And as early as the beginning of Wilson's first term, that direct advocacy by your own daughter is at least working on Ellen, is at least working on her mom. Ellen was always very cautious to not say things in any sort of public venue that could be seen as contradicting what Wilson was saying. She didn't want there to be any sort of anything in the press that there's like, sort of any scandal, minor as it may have been. That certainly did not mean she did not disagree with her husband vehemently behind the scenes. But the furthest she kind of goes to, I'd say perhaps even directly contradict Wilson, is in an interview she gives just before the inauguration in 1913. And she says that she is very clear in her support for suffrage and that Jessie, her daughter, was the one who convinced her to change her mind. She was born in the South. Ellen was born in the South immediately before really the Civil War, and had a fairly traditional view of a woman's role in life or in the world, which changes throughout her life. She goes to art school in New York. She really expands her horizons. And by the time she's about to become First Lady of the United States, she is at least willing to say out loud and to a reporter that I do support this issue. As the movement gains power through Wilson's presidency, Jessie and her sisters, Margaret and Eleanor, are there behind the scenes, and they're working on their father. And I think it's interesting that when the 19th Amendment is passed, when it is finally ratified, Margaret Wilson, the oldest, she doesn't join her father's Democratic Party. Instead, she joins the National Woman's Party, which is a group that had been protesting her dad for some time, and that we'll get to in a little bit, I'm sure. Edith, though, is the second wife, is very different. She's different than Ellen in any number of ways. She's a strong, independent person, but is not a clone for sure. Not an attempt, I think, of Wilson trying to replace Ellen. Or if he did, he didn't do a very good job. But they meet after Ellen's death and marry in December of 1915. And on the surface, she seems kind of like the ideal supporter of suffrage. She is a businesswoman. She is running a successful business in D.C., a jewelry store that she takes over after her first husband's death at a young age. She's the first woman in D.C. to have a driver's license. She has a little electric car, and she just tools around D.C. on her own, and is a significant force in the Washington social scene. But when a newspaper article claimed that in 1915, when it is now in the open, that Wilson and Edith are, I guess, dating, the newspaper article claims that Wilson's support for a suffrage referendum in New Jersey, perhaps that should be credited to Edith, that she helped convince him that he should vote for it, that he should be in favor of it. But Dr. Grayson, a close friend and the personal physician for Woodrow Wilson during his presidency, he laughs in a letter saying that she is exactly the opposite, that Edith does not support suffrage at all. And we don't have evidence that she is actively pushing Wilson to be anti-suffrage, that she is trying to slow that in any way. But she certainly does get very angry at suffragists who picket in front of the White House and who are vexing, shall we say, her husband, beginning in January of 1917. To the best of my knowledge, Edith never voted for president in her life. Even after the 19th Amendment, she is a resident of the District of Columbia, and it's not until, I believe it's the 23rd Amendment in 1961 that D.C. gets 3 electors and can vote in presidential elections. But because she dies in December of that year, she didn't have the opportunity to vote. The next D.C. eligible, I suppose, election would have been 64, and so she does not make it to that one. But essentially her whole adult life was lived in Washington, D.C. So to the best of my knowledge, she never voted, and certainly never voted for president.
Wilson spends periods of his presidency somewhat distracted by grief, distracted by love, distracted by war. He has a lot of pressures on him, on his personal life, on his professional life. How do these pressures influence his interest or willingness to do more in terms of suffrage?
So the tragedy of losing Ellen affects Wilson deeply. And suffrage is just one of the issues that receives very little attention from him in the months following. But the outbreak of World War I is another of those issues, that quote unquote minor issues that are not receiving the attention they deserve. When it comes to love, some see it as a good thing when he starts dating Edith. Maybe she'll win him over to the movement. Of course, she'll do no such thing. And for Wilson, and I think for a lot of the people, a lot of the men, of course, the people in power who are not fully on board with the suffrage movement, they tend to use distractions as excuses to not do something. It's like they're saying, why are you pushing for your right to vote now? We're trying to keep this country out of the war. We need to focus on that. Of course, that very quickly becomes, why are you focused on trying to get a vote now? We need to spend all our attention on fighting this war, and we'll deal with that later. You know, it's a convenient push off, I think, for folks, including Woodrow Wilson. But it ultimately, World War I will be a major force in changing Wilson's mind, at least in the way that he describes it in various speeches.
One of the things that really seems to frustrate Alice Paul and other suffragists is that they see suffrage as something very doable for Wilson politically. In the election of 1912, the Democratic Party not only wins the White House with Wilson, but they win control of the Senate, and they keep control of the House of Representatives, and they even pick up something like 61 seats in the House. In the 1916 election, this dominance narrows quite a bit. But you also, I think, at this point, probably have some Republicans who are in support of suffrage. So to this point, now I know he'll lose those majorities in the 1918 election, but to this point, is Wilson the problem? Why do you think he just didn't push it forward even prior to the U.S. entering World War I?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that Wilson is the problem, but there are a lot of ways where he is a problem. In the context of a national amendment, the president has no sort of formal constitutional, I guess, role. It's voted on in the House and the Senate. by such and such majorities, and then it has to go to the legislatures and get approved by the states themselves. Of course, in reality, the president has a huge role, an influential role, and that can be putting pressure on people, influencing public opinion just by speaking about it, even whipping votes. And all of these things Wilson will eventually do once he is fully behind the amendment push, again, rather than insisting that it's a state's issue. But I think in 1912, in his first term, he would have had a fair amount of difficulty convincing Congress to support this amendment. And again, it's not just Wilson. The push for the amendment it keeps getting introduced. It's I think one of the things that best recommends the idea of just because you don't think you're going to win a vote in Congress doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Doesn't mean you shouldn't go again. I mean, the suffrage amendment comes up several times and keeps getting defeated over the years, several times during the 19-teens, until eventually it does, until it finally does get over the hump, building momentum each time. In Wilson's first term, especially in those first 2 years in the Senate, in the Congress, he has Democratic majorities, but they are not all progressive Democrats. For many in the South, especially, who tended to be conservative Democrats, but not only, suffrage was viewed with suspicion, partly because it would have extended the franchise to Black women as well as white women. And they were already doing all they could to suppress African American voters without adding more to the rolls. But I mean, as the movement grows, and once Wilson starts turning toward the national approach as opposed to state by state, it is a painfully slow process for him to make this adjustment in his views. In the fall of 1916, he speaks to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the organization led by Carrie Chapman Catt. He states that he's come to this conference, this meeting, not to fight with somebody, but to fight. Not to fight with somebody, but to fight alongside somebody. He is there to join them in this fight, but in that same speech is really stressing the need for patience and that this is going to be slow and we got to take our time. And this doesn't go over very well. Again, thinking that he's going to just charm all these women, this does not go over the way he really wants to, and not really appreciated the way he's, well, that's great, you're on our side, but you're still not going to help. You're still just going to give us a pat on the back. And it will take a few more years before Wilson gives a full-throated endorsement of national suffrage.
In his second term, the United States enters World War I, and he gives speeches about freedom being essential to making the world safe for democracy. And a group of suffragists, the Silent Sentinels, they picket outside the White House. And this is something that really had not been done before. And they use his words against him. They compare him to Kaiser Wilhelm II. They also hold up signs asking visiting diplomats to not work with him until women have suffrage in the United States. This is very controversial. How does he respond to this, and how does the American public respond?
Yeah, they have some really great banners. The Kaiser Wilson ones, I think, are my favorite. But they take his language, this idealistic language he's using to describe what should happen at the end of this war, how people should be free and have the right to govern themselves, self-determination. And they're like, well, how come it's okay for Poles, but it's not okay for American women? And this is pretty effective. There are some good zingers, shall we say. And at first, Wilson is saying the right things, at least publicly, along the lines of, well, it's anyone's right in a free society to protest their government, and they have a right to do so, stuff like that. And he seems to feel that way privately, at least at the very beginning, too, though it reads today as more than a little patronizing. He sends folks out to these women who are standing in front of the White House, standing in front of on the other side of the fence, so on the sidewalk, and he offers them like sandwiches and coffee, and do you want to come inside? If some of you would like to come inside and speak with the president, he'd be happy to talk with you and hear what you have to say. These are, of course, would have been private and away from reporters. And this again might have been that flash of his own self-confidence with the ladies that we were just talking about. But the Silent Sentinels, the Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and all of them are they didn't come to the White House for sandwiches or to hear more of Wilson talking. They had plenty of Wilson talking. They had plenty of opportunities where they told Wilson what they thought. Their positions were not different. They didn't have any expectation that his were going to be different either. And so they're there to make a statement. And they turn down those offers that come at least from the White House, that come from Wilson. This is frustrating to him. It takes a little bit, but eventually he stops kind of being polite. He just sort of, when he enters and leaves the White House, he just sort of ignores them. But the harsher views, honestly, about them come from Edith. Edith had the habit of taking on and amplifying slights to Woodrow, real or imagined, honestly, far beyond what Wilson himself seemed to feel. And she kind of comes to hate the Silent Sentinels. That they are embarrassing themselves and their country, and of course her husband. The public reaction to them is mixed. This is one of the first groups to use the White House as a backdrop to gain publicity, and is the first to do so in a long-term way. This was not a week or two of a protest in front of the White House. It's a lovely week in June, and we'll just be out here for a bit and make sure people see us, see and be seen. They are there every day, rain or shine, from January of 1917 until June of 1919. It's not hundreds of them, sometimes it's just a few, but they are always there. And it's an unfortunate that, of course, color photography doesn't really come along in a mainstream way until much later. But all of these banners were often very colorful. They're bright purple and white and yellow, especially, which were the colors of the National Women's Party, which was putting on this protest. But others as well. They were meant to be eye-catching. But the sort of sepia tone that we get from old photographs doesn't communicate that, unfortunately, as well. But Alice Paul's group, the Silent Sentinel group, are one of the more extreme in the movement, in the broader sort of suffrage movement. And many other leaders, again, including women like Carrie Chapman Catt, they disapprove of the picket. This is not universally beloved by women or even by suffragists. They thought it might hurt the effort, that potentially it could alienate male voters and turn them away from supporting the cause. But the Silent Sentinels did have support. And the silent element of that is that they weren't there chanting. They were just standing there with their banners. But people that weren't the White House, people that weren't Woodrow Wilson, bringing them food or hot drinks, that was gratefully accepted. People donated money and wrote letters of support. But unfortunately, they also faced backlash. They also faced opposition from people who did not support the cause. And ultimately, that would include the government, the state. Several anti-suffrage groups at various times. I mean, again, they're out there for 2.5-ish years. At several different times, they would get together in their own groups, mobs even, and try to force the women away from the White House. They would try to steal their banners. Even the more mild of that is that they would stand there heckling and shouting at them for long stretches of time. And as time goes on, it takes, I believe it's a couple of months before this really begins in earnest. But the police in D.C. begin targeting them as well. They arrest them for things like obstructing traffic, which the women were not doing, or loitering, or other little picayune sort of charges. The women would be held in prison, sometimes for a few days or maybe a week, and then released because they would refuse to pay any fines. It's like, you pay $25 or you're going to D.C. jail for 3 or 4 days. And they were very principled and would not pay any of those sort of fines. As soon as they got out, they went right back to the line. When this tactic wasn't working, the police tried for harsher punishments, more punitive measures, I suppose. And that really culminates in the Night of Terror on November 14th in 1917. So many of these women had been arrested that there was no room in the not overly large D.C. jail, but especially not enough room to keep them separate from male prisoners. And so a number of them were sent to the Occoquan Workhouse, which was in just across the river in Northern Virginia. And it was in Occoquan, at the Occoquan Workhouse, that several of them tried to go on a hunger strike. And the doctors there force-fed them, shoved tubes down their throats to make them eat. It was a slurry of like milk and raw eggs and other. The goal, I suppose, was nutrition, to keep them from dying, from keeping them from protesting the way they wanted to. But that was going on for a little while until November 14th, when the superintendent of the workhouse told the guards to basically brutalize them into submission. They were beaten and kicked and choked. Lucy Burns was handcuffed to her cell door with her hands above her head and just left there all night. It was a horrific scene. Another woman was thrown into her cell so violently that she passed out, that she lost consciousness. Her cellmate, thinking she was dead, suffered a heart attack. It was a really horrible experience, a really terrible night. And thankfully, I suppose, the word of it gets out. And there was an uproar in the press, in the public. And within 2 weeks, they had all been released. And once they had healed, once they were ready, they went back to that line and would stay there again until June of 1919. They maintained their vigil until the amendment successfully passed both houses of Congress. And it took until June of 1919 for it to finally pass the Senate.
In a speech to the U.S. Senate, September 30th, 1918, Wilson says, "I regard the concurrence of the Senate in the constitutional amendment proposing the extension of the suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." Well, wow. How do we get to that point with Wilson?
It really is a huge change, especially coming from a historical figure that we tend to think of as kind of stubborn. And the Silent Sentinels were not the only factor in helping him make this change. But I think it shows how hard it is to ignore something that is happening right on your doorstep. But even while this vigil is going on, other suffrage groups are keeping up the pressure behind the scenes, lots of letters and more meetings with leaders. Wilson was also really swayed by the role women take on in the war effort. We think of figures like Rosie the Riveter as the quintessential symbol of World War II, but women are taking jobs in factories and in farms. They are in World War I as well. They are serving as nurses and drivers. There are thousands of them as drivers, truck drivers in Europe, and they are contributing mightily to all aspects of the war effort. In that same quote, in that same speech that you quoted, he also says, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? This war could not have been fought were it not for the services of the women." And suffrage groups and his own daughters certainly didn't let him forget that. And he makes his sort of announcement that he is now in favor of the national amendment process, as opposed to, again, state by state, in January of 1918. But it is that speech in front of the Senate where he goes to the Senate as they are about to decide to vote on this amendment. It ultimately doesn't succeed, but he keeps trying, and he continues working to achieve that passage.
Does he really just try to shepherd it through the House and Senate? And then does he actively try to encourage states to ratify it?
Yeah, well, Wilson's main role after that speech in September of 1918 is that he's a powerful advocate, and he is keeping up pressure on individual senators that he feels where it would behoove them to do so. Until it finally gets out of Congress. And then when it does, he does start pressuring state legislators as well. This he is following up his words about the importance and need for suffrage with action. But in October of 1919, he suffers a very serious stroke, and so his efforts to support the passage by this point through the states is significantly restricted, diminished. But he still celebrates the victory when the final state, I believe it's Tennessee, ratifies it in August of 1920 and makes it the official 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
Any final thoughts on Wilson and suffrage?
I think Wilson is an interesting figure in the fight for suffrage, but I certainly don't want it to seem like Wilson is the one that pushes it over the top, like he's that last piece that was missing and needed. It may have come sooner without him if there had been someone who was not sticking to state approach, but comes out as soon as they were inaugurated in 1918 saying, let's get this done. Or excuse me, in 1913 saying, let's get this done. But it's also possible that it may have come a little later, even with his support, if there was intransigence in the Senate. But I think not even the President of the United States could have held this back for much longer. It was coming regardless. And we can view Wilson's motivations, I think, in any number of ways. We could talk about it as if it was this true conversion to the cause of national suffrage. We could also talk about it as a cynical political move, that he saw the way the wind was blowing and he jumped on the bandwagon just right at the end there. But I think in this instance, at least, he does wind up on the right side of history. I know museums are supposed to be very neutral, but I don't think it's going out on a limb too much to say that the movement toward more universal suffrage was a good thing. And Wilson plays a very small role in that. It is the efforts of people like Alice Paul, like his daughter Jessie, like so many others all around the country, pushing together that eventually get it over the line and eventually put it into the Constitution.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.